My name is Kathleen Reeves. I'm 72 years old. I have to admit, sometimes the number feels heavier than the years themselves, not in the way people expect. I'm not frail or bitter, and I'm not eager to be young at heart either. I'm simply myself, as I've always been, just with more time to notice things. I live alone in a two-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of town. It used to be noisier, a family place, full of voices, footsteps, someone calling from the kitchen, "Dinner's ready." Now, mostly what I hear are the creaks of the floorboards and the rattle of the radiator in winter. I keep the place tidy, not immaculate, just orderly. Books line the hallway, little stacks here and there. I know exactly where everything is. Though my children like to sigh and say it's clutter, I was a teacher for over 40 years, English literature mostly, but I ended up teaching just as much about listening, speaking, and the business of living alongside words. My classrooms were always a little noisy. I encouraged students to talk, to write things down, to read their work out loud. I always believed that if you help someone hear themselves clearly, it makes life quieter in the best possible way. After retirement, I tried to keep a routine, mornings with tea and the crossword. Some days, a walk to the park, sometimes the library. I've never been afraid of being alone. Solitude can be a friend if you treat it well. My hands are still steady enough for embroidery, and I have a few old friends who drop by for cards or conversation. Most days, though, I keep to myself. There's a particular pleasure in not having to explain every moment to someone else. The only thing that troubles me now and then is the phone. New models arrive, and every time I think I've learned the buttons, the screen shifts or the ringer changes its mind. I muddle through, though. I've always believed in keeping up, even if just a little. Sometimes I make mistakes. Sometimes I have to call my son or daughter and ask, "How do I turn this thing off?" And they always laugh. Good naturedly, I tell myself. Sometimes I wonder if the amusement is tinged with something else, impatience maybe, or a kind of distant worry. My son David is 46, an engineer, practical to a fault. My daughter Julia is 44, a project manager with a schedule that would make a general sweat. They mean well, both of them. We talk regularly, though not always about much. Mostly they check in, sometimes a little too eagerly, as if I might slip off the edge of the earth if they stop looking. I suspect they think I'm older than I am, or perhaps more fragile. I hear it in their voices, the way they slow down their words when explaining things, as if they're talking to a child or a foreigner. "Are you eating well, Mom?" "Don't forget your keys, Mom." I nod and smile, let them have their comfort. Still, I'm aware of things they aren't. The slow changing of relationships, the way care can feel like gentle pressure if you're not careful. I listen to them closely, the same way I listened to students for all those years. And I wait. I've learned the value of patience. Sometimes at night, I think about the classes I used to teach. The joy of words, the spark in a student's eye when they found the perfect phrase. I suppose that's still my world in a way. Living among words, trying to say exactly what I mean, even if I say less these days. But don't let me give you the wrong impression. I manage well. I'm not lost. If I ever do get confused, it's usually over something trivial, a setting on the microwave, or which day the trash goes out. I keep a notepad for such things. It's a quiet life, but it's mine, and it fits me just fine. My birthday falls in the tail end of November, always just after the first real frost. That morning, I got up early, partly from habit and partly because I wanted the flat to feel warm and welcoming for when David and Julia arrived. I set out my small blue tablecloth, embroidered daisies, my own work from years back, and arranged a little stack of plates. I'd baked a banana loaf the night before, let it cool under a clean dish towel, and now I sliced it with steady hands, humming. It's odd how the weather makes everything feel sharper, how cold air makes every sound distinct. The kettle whistled. My old clock ticked above the radiator. I ran my hand across my hair, checked the mirror. You can do a lot with some good lipstick and decent posture. They arrived together, which doesn't always happen. I watched them from the window as they crossed the street. David in his neat winter coat, Julia with her scarf looped twice, her breath clouding in the cold. For a moment, I was swept back to when they were children, bundled up for school, shoving each other and laughing as they raced to the car. But they're grown now, grown and slightly hurried, as if the world is always a little bit late for them. I opened the door before they could knock. "Happy birthday, Mom," Julia beamed, and David followed suit. She handed me a small paper bag. "Fancy chocolates, my favorite." David carried an envelope, his fingers holding it almost delicately. I offered them tea, which they accepted, and we sat in my little kitchen with its window overlooking the empty yard. They glanced around, taking in the familiar. The old bookcase, the stack of crossword puzzles, the teapot with its chipped lid. Julia mentioned the chill. David quietly adjusted the thermostat. We exchanged the usual updates: work, the kids, my grandchildren, Julia's plans for a conference in spring. There was an edge to their voices, a kind of careful energy I've come to recognize. It's what I call the project tone, the one they use when they've organized something in advance. Finally, David cleared his throat. "Mom, we actually have something for you, a proper present this year." He smiled, almost apologetically, and slid the envelope across the table. Julia leaned in, eager. "Open it," I smiled, genuinely. "What have you two been up to?" The envelope was light, and when I opened it, I found a printed sheet and a small glossy card. On the sheet, in cheerful, rounded font, was a message: "Congratulations! You've been enrolled in the Modern Living for Seniors course, hosted at the Downtown Community Center." Below that, a schedule, a contact number, and, yes, a list of topics: staying safe online, using smartphones with confidence, spotting and avoiding scams, managing digital banking, connecting with family on social media. I blinked, reading it over twice, careful not to let my smile falter. There was a ribbon printed at the top, like a prize. "A course?" I asked. David jumped in. "It's supposed to be very practical. We saw the flyer at the library. There's a whole section on protecting yourself from phone scams. They say it's really common for people your age, and there's help for all the apps, too." Julia leaned forward. "We thought it might be nice. You always say you want to keep up with things, and, well, some of your friends were thinking about going, right?" She meant it kindly. I could hear it in her voice, the careful balance between suggestion and concern. I suppose I understand. The last time I called Julia to ask about a strange message on my phone, she sounded genuinely worried, even as she explained, step by step, what to press. I nodded, running my finger along the edge of the card. "It's a thoughtful idea," I said. I could feel them relax, as if they'd been holding their breath. I wondered if they had rehearsed this, if they'd worried I'd be offended, or maybe even hurt. There was a moment's quiet. I looked over at the kitchen window, at the cold garden. For a heartbeat, I felt every year of my age, not because I felt old, but because I could feel them looking at me through the lens of my age. It's a subtle thing, being cast into a role you didn't audition for. But I smiled. I always do. David finished his tea and glanced at his watch. "The first session is next Tuesday. We thought we'd drive you, make sure you find it, and everything." Julia was already checking the route on her phone, her finger tracing the map. I thanked them both, careful to sound grateful but not overjoyed. I don't want pity, and I don't need to be managed, but I do know what it means to let someone else feel helpful, so I smiled and squeezed their hands, one after the other. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen and stacked the dishes. I stood for a long while at the sink, looking at the card on the counter. A course for seniors. They want me to keep up. What they didn't know, and what I wasn't quite ready to share, was that the community center had already called me 2 weeks ago. Not as a student, but as a guest lecturer for a new series on cultural writing and effective communication. But that was a story for another day. For now, I slid the card into my notepad and wrote the date of the first session in my neat looping script. I am not offended. I am not even surprised. I know my children. But sometimes you have to let things play out, just to see who's really paying attention. I suppose the only real choice when your children give you a solution is to accept it gracefully. I've always believed in letting people have their good intentions. It costs so little, and sometimes it gives you back more than you expect. So I said yes. Thank you, I told them, my fingers tracing the glossy edge of the enrollment card again. It's a good idea, really. I smiled, not too broadly, but sincerely, like an actor who's memorized the role after years of rehearsal. I'd like to see what they teach. I'm sure I could use a few new tricks. Julia brightened, relief obvious in her whole posture. She's always been sensitive to tone, quick to sense embarrassment or resistance, and always quick to fix. She patted my hand. It'll be fun, Mom. There's even a coffee break in the middle. And it's at the new community center. It's beautiful, you'll see. David, too, softened. There's security, lots of staff. You'll be with a good crowd. If you like it, maybe you'll even make new friends. His mouth twitched up. He's always been shy about making connections, but he wants them for me. I nodded, already writing the date in my head. Tuesday, 10 in the morning. Community Center, room 203. I asked about the instructor. Just curiosity, I said. Julia fumbled with the schedule, her eyes scanning the printout. Someone named Emily for the first session. Then, oh, look, Kathleen Reeves. You share a name with one of the lecturers. I just smiled. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a gentle peace. I let them help tidy up, though it wasn't needed. Julia reorganized my kitchen drawers, her idea of a gift. David fixed a cupboard hinge. I know they both felt better, performing their rituals of care. After they left, I sat in the silence. Their present on the table, the flowers in the window, the clock ticking on. It's a curious feeling, receiving a gesture like this. There's love, yes, but also a small stinging reminder. You are being managed, organized, watched over as if you're more fragile than you are. I took the card and schedule into my little study and put them next to my notes for the lecture series. I looked over my draft. Pages and pages of handwritten observations, outlines, anecdotes about language, about power, about care. Because 2 weeks ago, the community center called me, not as a student, but as a teacher. A new Life in Letters program. They wanted me to open a lecture series, cultural writing, the ethics of communication, the ways we shape and are shaped by words. I'd already said yes. My topic for the first session, how not to confuse care and control in everyday communication. It was almost comical, this overlap. Here I was, signed up by my children to be taught how to live in the modern world, while being quietly trusted by strangers to help others navigate their own stories. I did not tell my children. I simply thanked them again when they called that evening. Julia reminded me to bring a notebook, just in case. David suggested I take notes on anything confusing and promised to help debrief after the first session. I agreed. I'll keep you posted, I said. That night, I went through my notes for the lecture, adding a few new thoughts about generational language, the gentle and not so gentle ways families communicate care. I thought about how easily a kind gesture can slip into condescension, how quickly protection becomes permission to control. I am not offended by their gift. If anything, it tells me something important. The patterns repeat. Children want to help. Parents want to keep their dignity. And sometimes, the most powerful way to teach is to listen, to let the lesson unfold quietly, without making a point of it. The day of the first session was set, and I was ready. For both roles, teacher and student, and for what might happen when those two identities finally collided. The morning of the course dawned gray and tentative, the kind of morning when the sky sits low and makes the whole world feel like it's wrapped in cotton wool. I woke up early, not from nerves, but from habit. Old teachers never quite lose that instinct for being the first one in the building. I boiled water for tea, careful with my favorite cup, and set out a slice of banana loaf for breakfast. The house was still, humming with the quiet anticipation of something gently momentous. Julia called at 8:30, her voice brisk with the practiced calm of a person managing logistics. "We'll be there at 9 sharp, Mom. I'll drive. David will meet us out front. He's got the directions up already. Oh, and bring your glasses and your charger, just in case." "Of course, darling," I replied. "I have my notes and my glasses." I dressed with care, a dark blue sweater and comfortable slacks, silver earrings that caught the light when I moved. For a moment, I hesitated over my old school lanyard, Kathleen Reeves, Language Arts. I tucked it into my purse. Not quite yet. By 9, Julia was at my door, breathless and pink-cheeked from the wind, her hair neatly pinned back, phone in hand, already answering emails on the front step. She stepped in, glanced around the living room, her eyes scanning, always checking. I wondered what she saw: the slightly faded rug, the books stacked on the side table, the knitting basket beside my chair, relics or reminders. Or just Mom's things, comforting in their predictability. "Ready?" she said, her smile bright and professional. "As I'll ever be," I replied, tucking my notebook into my bag. The drive across town was familiar and not. I watched the streets blur past, shops I'd visited, schools I'd taught in, neighborhoods where friends had lived and moved away. Julia chatted about the traffic, about how nice it was for the city to offer these courses, about how everyone needed to keep up. I listened, nodding, offering small encouragements, hearing between the lines all the things she wasn't saying. "I worry about you. I'm not sure you're safe. I need to know you're cared for." David was waiting by the community center when we arrived. He waved, grinning, always a little awkward in his casual clothes, as if he wasn't quite sure how to relax outside of work. "All set?" he asked, taking my bag from me. "Perfectly," I said. The building itself was new, glass and pale brick, automatic doors, everything wide and accessible. Inside, the lobby was bright with morning light, and a cheerful woman at the reception desk checked names as people arrived. Julia handed over my registration card with a flourish. "First floor, room 203, the woman said, smiling at me. "Welcome, Ms. Reeves." I smiled back, warmth in my chest. "Thank you," I said. We made our way upstairs, past a wall covered in flyers, yoga classes, knitting circles, IT workshops. The corridor was full of quiet bustle. Older men and women in coats and scarves, some chatting, some looking quietly apprehensive. I recognized a few faces from around town: Mrs. Foley from church, Mr. Ellison who once ran the bookstore. Some looked surprised to see me. I nodded hello. Inside room 203, tables were arranged in a wide U shape. A smart projector stood ready at the front. Julia and David steered me to a seat near the middle. "We'll stay in the back," Julia said, "just to see how it all goes." I nodded, playing along. As people trickled in, there was a murmur of conversation. Some shared anxieties about smartphones. Others were clearly just here for the social break. I could see Julia sizing up the room, glancing at the syllabus on her phone. David fidgeted with the water cooler. Then, at precisely 10 o'clock, the moderator entered, a tall woman with salt and pepper hair and an air of practiced cheer. She called the room to order, welcomed everyone, and ran through the housekeeping items: where to find the restrooms, where coffee would be served, who to ask for help. She read through the schedule, her voice warm but efficient. "And now, for our first session of the new series," she announced. "We have the pleasure of welcoming Kathleen Reeves, an oral and written language specialist, former educator, and a passionate advocate for clear communication. She'll be speaking on how not to confuse care and control in everyday communication." There was a pause. I stood up steady, as if I'd done this 1,000 times before. Because, of course, I had. Julia's head whipped around so fast I could hear her earrings click. David looked as if someone had suddenly pulled a rug from under his feet. I met neither of their eyes. I walked to the front of the room, opened my notes, and set them gently on the lectern. The room grew still. I saw in the faces before me a range of expressions: surprise, curiosity, cautious optimism. I let my hands rest lightly on the lectern, no trembling. I took a breath. "In our lives, communication is more than words," I began, my voice filling the space, calm and sure. "Sometimes it's the very air we live in. It shapes how we feel about ourselves and how we let others treat us. Today, I want to talk about the difference between caring for someone and quietly taking over their life in the name of care." There was silence, a good kind of silence, the kind you get when everyone is paying attention. I glanced briefly at the back row, where my children sat frozen in their seats, and then I began to teach, not as a student, not as a recipient, but as myself. I took in the room as I always had: old habit, a teacher's scan, 30 faces, maybe more, each holding some mixture of expectation, politeness, and the faint defensiveness that comes with being told they need to be brought up to speed. The age range was broad. Some looked scarcely past 50, others bent with age, all of them gathered under the polite label of seniors. It made me smile inside. Labels rarely fit well, especially ones given by someone else. My children sat in the back, a few chairs apart, but with identical postures: upright, attentive, hands folded over their knees. I knew those stances: Julia's manager listening, David's problem-solving silence. I felt a flicker of something like mischief, but mostly a warm old sadness. Children think they are protecting you from the world, not knowing the world is simply life. I began not with the lesson plan, but with a question. When was the last time someone told you how to do something you've done your whole life? There was a ripple of laughter, hesitant at first, then genuine. A man near the window raised his hand. "This morning, my daughter told me how to butter toast so I don't make a mess on my shirt." Laughter again, lighter now. The room was with me. "Isn't it strange," I said, "how quickly advice can feel like instructions, or instructions like commands?" I spoke then, not lecturing, but simply opening windows. About intonation, how a voice can sharpen or soften a phrase without changing the words at all. About the difference between "Are you sure you want to do that?" and "Do you need help?" About how we learn all our lives to accept small encroachments. "Let me carry that. Let me show you. Let me handle it." Sometimes love and concern, sometimes habit. About the invisible hand that arranges your day for you until you are simply drifting in someone else's tide. I watched the nods, the eyes widening, the little smiles of recognition. There was a dignity in the room, a collection of lives lived on their own terms. I felt it. I honored it. I didn't look at my children, not directly, but in the corners of my vision, I saw Julia's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. David's shoulders shifting as if he was uncomfortable in his own skin. I told a story, one from my classroom days, about a student whose mother helped him with every essay, so much so that the essays sounded more like her than him. The boy, I said, lost his voice in all that help, and it took a year for him to write a paragraph in his own words. He never failed, I said, but he never learned either, not until someone let him risk being imperfect on his own. Another ripple in the room. A few people jotted down notes. One woman smiled at me, her eyes bright with understanding. I talked about phrases. Let me do that for you. It's easier if I just handle it. You don't need to worry about that. All of them delivered softly, kindly, but with the gentle pressure of a hand that never quite lets go. I let the silence build, a tool, not an accident. Then, quietly, we can take away a person's right to choose without ever raising our voices. Sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone is to take care of them until they disappear. A hush followed, thicker than any lecture I'd given. People were thinking, and I could feel the questions in the air. Who do I do this to? Who does this to me? I could sense my children, their gaze fixed on me, eyes that wanted to look away but didn't dare. I finished with something I'd written in my notes just the night before. Real care lets you be yourself. Real care asks, what do you want to do? And waits for the answer. It's harder sometimes to wait, but it's braver too. I closed my folder. The room breathed out as if it had been holding a collective breath. I thanked them for listening, for trusting me with their stories. And at last, I allowed myself a glance at the back row. Julia's eyes were shining, not tears, but something like recognition. David looked down, fiddling with the strap on his watch. I knew then that I had said what I needed to say, not just to the group, but to them, not to wound, but to wake. When the moderator thanked me, her voice was softer than before. There was a brief pause and then applause, gentle but real. Several people stood to stretch, but a few came straight up, wanting to talk, to share, to say thank you. But my eyes, for a moment, stayed with my children, who sat quietly as the room shifted around them. For once, they had nothing to teach me, and I had nothing left to prove. The applause faded in its own time, somewhat longer than I expected, lingering like a gentle wave that took its time receding. A few people rose and shuffled forward, eager to ask questions, while others gathered their things quietly, already digesting what had been said. I smiled, answered a question about family letters, recommended a book to an older man who said he'd always wanted to write his memoirs, but didn't know where to start. There was an energy to these conversations, a kind of gratitude that was quiet but unmistakable. No fanfare, no gushing, just people quietly recognizing themselves in the words and wanting to hold on to it. In the midst of it, I saw Julia and David hovering at the edge of the crowd, waiting. Julia had her arms folded, an old reflex of hers, and David looked as if he'd just discovered he'd left his keys somewhere important. I finished my conversation, thanked everyone who approached, then made my way to my children. Their eyes were full of questions, some unspoken, some perhaps not even fully realized yet. Julia spoke first. Her voice was controlled, steady, but a little softer than usual. You didn't tell us you were teaching, Mom. I smiled gently. No, I suppose I didn't. David tried for a smile, failed, then tried again. So this was your idea? You've been doing this already? I let out a breath, slow and measured. 2 weeks ago, they called me, asked if I'd like to give a series of lectures. I thought it sounded worthwhile. I didn't know you'd sign me up as a student, of course, but it's a good course. There's always something to learn, isn't there? Julia looked away for a moment, her jaw working. I could see her thinking through 100 small moments every time she'd explained a setting on my phone, every gentle correction, every well meaning suggestion. She didn't apologize. She didn't have to. The silence between us was enough. The moderator came over, all warmth and gratitude, and I introduced her to my children. She spoke highly of the program, said how lucky they were to have such an experienced voice in the series. Julia smiled at her, a little tightly. David nodded. We made our way down the corridor. The class was dispersing, pockets of laughter and talk trailing behind us. The air outside was crisp, still carrying the scent of the morning's rain. Julia unlocked the car, David taking my bag again, a gesture that suddenly felt smaller, more ordinary, neither care nor control, just something to do with his hands. The car ride home was quieter than usual. Julia drove, focused on the road. David sat beside her, fiddling with the air vent. I sat in the back, watching the city drift by through rain-speckled glass. After a few minutes, Julia spoke. "You were really good, Mom." There was a weight to the words. Not quite surprise, but a kind of recalibration. I could feel them shifting in their understanding of me, making room for someone they hadn't expected. "Thank you, dear," I said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. David added, "You made a lot of sense. It's not always easy to hear, I guess." We drove on, the conversation drifting, light and heavy at the same time. Julia asked about the next lecture, if I needed a ride, what I'd talk about next time. I said I'd manage, that the community center was close enough to walk, weather permitting. There was a gentle acceptance in the car. Not defeat, not embarrassment, but a growing realization. The woman in the passenger seat was more than the sum of their concern. We pulled up to my apartment. Julia stepped out first, came around to open my door, but I was already there, bag in hand. David hesitated, then hugged me. Unexpected, warm, brief. At the door, Julia said, "You could have just told us it was a bit much." I looked at her, not unkindly. "I could have, but you wanted me to be taught, so I went." I let the words settle, no sting, just truth. She nodded, taking it in. They didn't linger. There was no need. I watched them drive off, the car turning down the road. The house felt different as I let myself in, quieter, but not empty. I set my bag down, hung up my coat, and stood in the center of the living room for a long moment. Sunlight crept through the window, dust motes swirling in the beam. I thought of all the ways care can twist itself into knots, all the ways children try to hold on and parents try to let go. It was a good day, not for the lesson given, but for the silence that followed. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of all the things finally understood. Later, when Julia called to say she'd gotten home safely, there was something lighter in her voice. "We'll see you soon?" "Of course," I said. "Anytime." And I meant it more than ever. The days after the lecture felt curiously spacious, as if a pressure in the air had finally eased. I returned to my routine, but it was subtly changed, as if someone had drawn open a curtain I didn't realize was blocking the light. At first, the phone was quiet. Julia and David called, of course, but their voices were different. Lighter, almost hesitant, sometimes lingering in a thoughtful pause before asking about my day. There was less of the old script. "Did you remember your medicine, Mom? Don't forget to lock the door." Instead, they asked, "How was the class this week? What are you reading lately?" Sometimes they just wanted to listen. At the community center, word traveled quickly. After that first session, a woman from the next township arrived to sit in. The following week, the circle of chairs had to widen. People began to arrive early, eager to ask questions, to share stories of their own, about siblings, children, neighbors who meant well, and about their own desire to stay themselves as they grew older. The program coordinator asked if I'd consider holding extra sessions. There was a waiting list. I agreed with the gentle stipulation that anyone could come, student or not. One afternoon, a retired postman brought in his daughter, who sat quietly, listening, her eyes wide as she heard her father talk about how it felt to be managed. Later, she thanked me privately, said she'd never understood before. I realized how many people, young and old, were hungry for that space, a room where dignity was assumed, not negotiated. As the weeks went on, the boundaries at home softened too. Julia stopped tidying up my kitchen drawers on her visits. Sometimes she brought over a loaf of bread or a new book she thought I'd like, and we'd talk over tea, letting the conversation drift where it would. David, for his part, offered help when I asked, but no longer insisted. He came by with his youngest one Saturday, and the three of us spent an hour putting together a jigsaw puzzle, a patient, companionable silence, broken only by the small satisfaction of matching shapes. And I noticed something else. The gifts changed. That Christmas, instead of another digital gadget with a manual as thick as a phone book, Julia handed me a beautifully bound notebook. "For your stories," she said, and waited to see if I liked it, not assuming I would. David brought a potted lemon tree. "For your window," he said, "to remind you spring comes back." Simple, personal, no instruction attached. I still fumbled with my phone sometimes, but now, when I called to ask about a stubborn update or why the screen had rearranged itself again, I heard more patience at the other end. Sometimes we figured it out together. Other times, I decided it wasn't worth fixing, and that was all right too. There were, of course, moments when the old habits crept in, a cautious reminder here, a nervous look there, but I learned to answer them calmly, to receive their care without letting it box me in. "I appreciate it," I would say. "I know you do," they would reply. What surprised me most was how quickly my role in the community center grew. People brought friends, neighbors, even adult children who sat in, at first skeptical, then quietly attentive. We spoke about language, yes, but more about what it means to belong to yourself, even as others try to keep you safe. There were laughs, a few tears, and once, a spontaneous round of applause when an 80-year-old woman stood and declared, "I'm still the boss of my own story. Thank you very much." And in all this, my children listened, not just to my lectures, but to me, to my silences, to the shape of my life. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes I could feel them struggling to find their place in this new landscape, but the trying was enough, more than enough. For the first time in years, I felt the delicate peace of being seen as I am, not as a project or a risk to be managed, but as a person who had weathered enough storms to stand firm on her own. One evening, months later, as the spring light stretched late into the evening, Julia called just to talk. No reminders, no lists. We spoke about her work, her children, the books she was reading. Before hanging up, she said, "I'm proud of you, Mom, not for the class, just for being you." After the call, I sat by the window, tracing the edge of a lemon leaf between my fingers, the smell sharp and alive. I thought of all the ways life can shrink or expand, depending on the rooms we make for one another. I thought of the waiting list at the center, of the notebooks filled with stories and letters. I thought of my children, sitting in the back row, seeing me clearly for the first time in years. It wasn't everything. It didn't undo all the tangled years or cure the ache of time passing. But it was enough, quiet, steady, and true. And sometimes enough is the very best gift there is.